Why didn't you tell me? You told me Vader betrayed and murdered my father.
Your father was seduced by the dark side of the Force. He ceased to be Anakin Skywalker and became Darth Vader. When that happened, the good man who was your father was destroyed. So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view.
A certain point of view?
Luke, you're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view. Anakin was a good friend. When I first knew him, your father was already a great pilot, but I was amazed how strongly the Force was with him. I took it upon myself to train him as a Jedi. I thought that I could instruct him just as well as Yoda. I was wrong.
There is still good in him.
He's more machine now than man, twisted and evil.
I can't do it, Ben.
You cannot escape your destiny. You must face Darth Vader again.
I can't kill my own father.
Then the Emperor has already won. You were our only hope.
Yoda spoke of another.
The other he spoke of is your twin sister.
But I have no sister.
To protect you both from the Emperor, you were hidden from your father when you were born. The Emperor knew, as I did, if Anakin were to have any offspring, they would be a threat to him. That is the reason why your sister remains safely anonymous.
Leia. Leia is my sister.
Your insight serves you well. Bury your feelings deep down, Luke. They do you credit, but they couldn't be made to serve the Emperor.
Welcome, Masters and Padawans, to episode 548 of Full of Sith. It's me, Brian Young, host of the show, and with me as ever, the other host, the redoubtable Holly Fry. Holly, how you doing?
I'm so good. How about you?
I am also so good.
Said with so much confidence and surety.
Yeah, no, that's my jam. That's my jam. I'm just a ball of confidence and surety.
Yeah, I envy that, and rock on. Although I know the point is that we're not. Yeah, I'm just tired. I'm good, but tired.
Yeah. So I wanted to have a conversation today, and I thought this was really interesting. That there's this theme in Star Wars that's been going since A New Hope, that you can't necessarily trust anything anybody says.
Right. I mean, one of the elements of it, right? It's not necessarily lying, although it sometimes is. That I think sometimes is easy to forget is that the people in Star Wars haven't seen Star Wars.
Yeah.
So they don't know all the stuff the audience knows.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Like there is a sort of fan who is a completely valid sort of fan that sort of hangs on everything said out of every character's mouth as some sort of truism, and that it adds to the lore and the mythology, and then they write it down as though it's another chapter in the Star Wars Bible.
Right.
But, I mean, like, how often do you go like, oh, I went and did this a few years ago, and then someone writes down happened 3 years ago.
Right.
But when you actually go through and calculate it out, you go, oh, hell, that was 10 years ago. Man, where'd the time go?
All the time.
Yeah, so, like, there's these idioms that people use, and there's this passage of time that they're not always, like, conscious of, or stories get embellished over the years, or reconfigured to make them look better, or whatever. Like, this is something that's just totally normal for people. I imagine it's similar for species across the galaxy.
Seems like.
Yeah. And so it's interesting to try to parse what truth is, like with a capital T, like what is the true version of a story in Star Wars. And I mean, I think a lot of this roots in the idea that, like, from the very beginning of Star Wars, we've had Obi-Wan telling Luke that Vader betrayed and murdered his father, which is true from a certain point of view, which is what he tells him in Return of the Jedi. And there's been these really interesting ideas that have popped up in Star Wars, especially in the new canon, where what is it that we perceive, or how George Lucas falls into the cracks of things to change things, right? Like, I love little things about how, like, Anakin doesn't necessarily know what General Grievous looks like or how tall he is in Revenge of the Sith, and that one throwaway joke.
Right.
They spent an entire TV series having Anakin artfully dodge General Grievous. But like, everything is from a character's point of view, and that there's nothing sort of objective. And I think one of the biggest ways to look at this, one of the biggest things to look at this is, like, I know that there's a lot of people upset about the differences between the Tales of the Jedi version of how Ahsoka gets her sabers and the Ahsoka novel by E.K. Johnston story, right, where Ahsoka gets her lightsabers. But they're essentially the same. Aesthetically, they're the same. The characters might be different, but they're different to each medium, so that the person perceiving them, which is us, from our point of view, which one is more true than the other? I think they're both equally true. And that we don't need to be so concerned about which one is the capital T truth, because both are right for the point of view of the medium they told the story in. Both are right from the point of view of sort of the narrator or the author. And those minor details can get lost in the shuffle, and they're not that big of a deal.
Yeah. I mean, I sympathize with people who struggle with those different kinds of storytelling, right? Because I understand the impetus to be like, I am going to really catalog all things Star Wars so that I have, the fullest knowledge I possibly can. And when contradictory elements come into play, it can be hard, if you're thinking that way, to parse and try to figure out, how do I weight one over the other to make it the one that is the thing I should remember or memorize, right? I understand how that is stressful to people who are trying to be kind of their own, lore aficionados. And if that sounds cavalier, I'm not trying to in any way denigrate that. I just I understand that way of thinking being making it very difficult to parse those kinds of differences and reconcile them in a way that doesn't feel problematic. But at the same time, I kind of love the idea. I mean, it's kind of the same thing, right? I'm sure there are people who've been your friends for, decades and decades, and you'll talk about something that happened as kids, and you'll discuss an event and be like, that's not how that went. I thought this happened. And that's often very funny and delightful, and you get more insight to how things went down, whether you agree that the other person's version is correct. But, like, to me, that just makes a richer story to know that different people remember it differently.
Well, you're also used to approaching things from a historical perspective, right? Like, you're used to parsing through a whole bunch of different data and trying to come up with the amalgamation of what the story might actually have been.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It was so fascinating. Anakin was in school at one point, and he was learning this in a history class, and they made him go and read the British versions of the Boston Massacre and the American versions of the Boston Massacre. And it is so amazing how, I mean, the Boston Massacre unquestionably happened. Whether the name massacre
right is really the right way to describe it.
Yeah. But, like, and the point of view of the participants, the British are like, yeah, these colonists are jackasses. Like, look at how awful this is. But then the Americans have a completely different spin on it based on what their perspective is and how the newspapers at the time did that. And trying to figure out reality from that can be fun, right?
Yeah.
And Star Wars can be the same way. Star Wars, if we're going to treat Star Wars like it's history, that's the sort of history I think we should treat it as.
100%.
And that's why I'm baffled by I don't understand. I think we talked about this a couple weeks ago about from a media literacy perspective, but there's this combative nature that people use to watch things where it's like, I have the facts, and the second something contradicts a fact, I'm not going to let the story play out before I call this fact that feels like it's contradictory to a fact I know a plot hole, like the Ki-Adi-Mundi thing, right?
Yes.
I think it was purposeful that they chose Ki-Adi-Mundi to be that
100%.
character in the Acolyte because of his line in The Phantom Menace where he says, impossible, the Sith have been extinct for a millennium. And I think that storytelling sort of signed the death warrant for a lot of characters in the Acolyte, and still has, because I think Ki-Adi-Mundi probably doesn't realize that there's Sith out there because he never gets that report back.
Right.
But saying, wait, how can this be possible and him be part of this show and this explores the dark side, when he says that, they've broken Star Wars, is sort of the wrong approach for this, because the people working on it are really smart and they know Star Wars better than all of us.
Right. Again, Ki-Adi-Mundi has never seen Star Wars.
Yeah, exactly.
He doesn't know what we know.
Exactly. And he didn't get to watch the reruns of The Acolyte. Right? Like, if he would have been able to watch The Acolyte like it was Spaceballs, that's still such a funny bit. If he got to watch The Acolyte like it's Spaceballs, then yes, I could see it being a plot hole that he didn't mention that the Sith were there in Phantom Menace. But having to separate out that idea that, like, what each character knows comes from that different perspective is really fascinating. And honestly, I think this is a little bit of where people got hung up on The Last Jedi.
Yes.
So obviously, The Last Jedi took a lot of inspiration from Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon.
Yes.
For those of you who haven't seen Rashomon, please
hurry. Go.
So Rashomon, again, a Kurosawa film. Kurosawa was sort of one of the chief influences on George Lucas and pretty much every filmmaker who's been working on Star Wars since, right? Like Bryce Dallas Howard, her introduction to Star Wars and The Mandalorian was sort of a remake of Seven Samurai. George Lucas took significant influence from Seven Samurai and Hidden Fortress for A New Hope, and a lot more for Phantom Menace. The Jedi are sort of predicated on that whole era of film. Rashomon is a very short movie, actually. It's only about 89 minutes long, and it tells one story from 4 different perspectives. And you're left to put the pieces together about what happened for real in the story and who the villain was. Ridley Scott did this as well to frustratingly beautiful effect in The Last Duel with Adam Driver and Matt Damon and Ben Affleck.
Yeah.
Did you see that movie?
Mm-mm.
Huh?
Not for lack of interest, but I have not gotten to it yet.
Oh, I was like, it involves, spoiler alert, it involves a sexual assault. And I was like, yes. I don't want to see that. I don't want to see that at all. And then it happened to be on or available, and I was like, fine, I'll watch it. And I was like angry with myself for how good it was by the end. But it does that as well, and it sort of changes your perspective on what you believe and what the characters believe, and that's one of the really great things about film. And I understand audiences getting upset, and this is nothing new. I don't know if you're familiar with Alfred Hitchcock's film Stage Fright.
Oh, yes.
Alfred Hitchcock's Stage Fright has this opening where an actor comes to a young actress, and he's got this bloody dress, and he's like, holy crap, here's this story. And it cuts to this flashback in the film of of everything that happens leading up to this murder and how she's trying to save him because he's really innocent and everything. And the film continues from her point of view of the story that she's been told. Come to the end of the story, and she's been basically lying on behalf of the guy who really did commit the murder because he lied to her. Yeah. And audiences of the day were very upset about this because they felt that the camera had to be a neutral observer, an objective observer. And Alfred Hitchcock really was the one to start breaking those rules. And now it's very much hailed as a masterpiece. Kurosawa took that a step further with Rashomon. And I think looking at the camera as an objective observer is something that we can't afford to do, especially in a series like The Acolyte, especially when you look at the bracketed 16 years ago episodes.
Right.
But The Last Jedi basically did the same thing that Rashomon did, where you had Luke tell his very sanitized version of a story that happened between he and Ben, and then Ben tells his very aggressive, vicious story of his perspective of it, and then Luke owns up to what I would view as sort of the middle ground between the two.
Right.
And Rey is left to wonder which is the real story, and the audience is left to wonder which is the real story. But regardless of what the real story is, from Ben's perspective, his view is the real story for him.
Right.
So I was so shocked by how many audience members were like, Luke would never try to kill his nephew. And it's like, well, he didn't. And they're like, did you watch the same movie? And it's like, well, yeah, like, why are you believing the point of view of the villain? Like, who was obviously wrong.
Yeah. That part to me is very fascinating because we know. I feel like we know. I feel like it was clear that he had that moment of, I don't know if temptation is even the right word, where he was considering that path very seriously and realized that he couldn't. Right. To me, that seems like the most obvious or truest version of that story, where, you know, there is the fallibility of Luke and his fear about the future if he didn't figure out a way to stop the progression of Ben Solo to becoming a dark side user, but then ultimately realizes he can't. Like, to me, that makes the most sense of the various versions that we got. But I certainly know people who think that Luke Skywalker wanted to kill his nephew full stop without the nuance of, but then he realized that was wrong.
Yeah, before he acted on it. And before he acted on it in the same way that he did with Vader, right? When Vader taunts him with that he'd turn Leia, Luke loses control and cuts Vader's hand off and only stops himself when he sees the symbolism and the similarities between his bionic hand and Vader's. There's a reason Luke cuts off Vader's right hand and sees the wire sticking out and looks down at his own black gloved right hand. You know what I mean? Like, all of that stuff is on purpose.
Yes.
And for him to spend the next 30 years controlling that instinct to go from hacking off Vader's hand and trying to kill him to, I'll ignite my lightsaber and then put it back. That's huge.
Yeah.
That's a huge character growth. And that's not so, I mean, like, what problem did you have in your 20s that you solved once and then never had to struggle with again?
Right. What inherent behavioral pattern that you have that you've tried to correct in some way? Yeah, it's very hard. I have seen, as you, that same exact logic of why people didn't like The Last Jedi, because that wasn't their Luke. And it gives me a headache.
Yeah, no, it gives me a headache too. And when you look at the themes of Star Wars, like that idea that these things that from your point of view you need to prevent, and that you need to learn to let go. Like, that's such a prevalent theme. Like, if Anakin would have learned to let go, as horrible as that was, like if he'd have learned to let go of his mother and not gone to Tatooine and slaughtered all of those sand people, that would have been better, right? There was nothing he could have done from the time he started having the visions about his mother to save her. But he went off and he did horrible things to try to correct that. When he saw that vision of Padme dying, he caused the thing he was trying to prevent. Yeah. And Luke knew that. And Luke saw that that had happened. And that Luke saw that the more he saw visions of the future and the more he wanted to change those things, the more he was going to cause them, which is why he did cut himself off from the Force, because he's doing the heroic thing. Because if he keeps seeing visions of a future that's so dark that makes him want to kill his nephew, or who's next? Like, if he sees a vision of the future where if like Leia's going to take over the galaxy, is he going to go murder his sister too? Like, when Yoda says like always in motion is the future, you've got to like back off from that. Luke knows that it's too powerful for him to be able to trust his instincts for, and if he wants to prevent those horrible futures he's seeing, not seeing them is a better way to do it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it goes even beyond necessarily him feeling concerned that that he would do something bad or dark, but merely recognizing that, like, in trying to control the future, I will mess it up.
Yes.
In any way, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be as grave an action as considering violence against a family member or an innocent. Just anything you try to do. I mean, there's that whole thing you can pluck apart from Empire of like, hey, you weren't supposed to go to Bespin, my dude, and like how that resulted in him and Vader and him learning in a way that Ben and Yoda did not intend for him to learn, what his actual bloodline was, and all of the things that he set in motion, may have actually made that situation worse instead of better, right? If he had not shown up, would Vader have been so quick to dump Han in the carbonite? We don't know exactly, right? Like, so there's a lot to be said for his choice to where he's like, every time I try to fix it, I make it worse.
So I would encourage people to use the word recontextualize rather than retcon. Mm-hmm. Because that's what Star Wars has done from day one. From day one as far as Empire is concerned, right? Because you can't recontextualize one movie in the context of one movie.
Right.
But as far as the expanding lore of Star Wars goes, watching Empire from that first moment in May 1980, and Vader says, Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father, and Luke says, he told me enough, he told me you killed him, and he says, no, I'm your father. That's not, like, there are people...
Plot hole!
Yeah, there are people back in 1980 that said straight up, like, they're done with Star Wars, they ruined Obi-Wan Kenobi, and it's like, there were others who were like, is Vader lying? Could Obi-Wan have met something else? Like, that's the way you need to engage that. But there were definitely people who just disconnected from Star Wars there. And
you don't have to tell me. I was there for it.
Oh, yeah.
I remember having this discussion with kids on the playground and with people in my family and being like, I don't think that's what, there's more coming. We don't.
But, like, I really love having some bit of new information and then having to go back through the rest of it and see how the context changes. And a lot of people say, like, oh, it's a retcon. They're just adding stuff. It doesn't matter. Like, there's people who are upset that the Clone Wars and Ahsoka's existence adds more context to Anakin's fall. And they're like, well, that shouldn't count for the movie. That shouldn't make Revenge of the Sith better for you because that should have been in Revenge of the Sith. And it's like, that's not how Star Wars works. In most film series, yeah, like in the James Bond series, right? Like usually they don't ask you to have an overwhelming knowledge of all 25 movies to understand or get the next adventure. They're just spy yarns.
Right.
Right? Like it's just like, okay, I know who James Bond is generally, I know what his MO is generally, and I know that he's going to take down a bad guy because he's from British Secret Service. And you don't need to know that the Contessa Teresa Di Vincenzo like was his wife and she died, although they pay mention to it here or there. You don't need to know all of the little minutia, and when something changes, it doesn't go back and force you to like reevaluate everything. The thing I love about Star Wars is that like everything builds on everything else, so everything is a comment on everything else, right? Everything changes something. Like Ahsoka radically gets me to radically look at the Jedi differently. I love how they changed the way we see some of these Dark Jedi with Baylan and Shin, and it sort of adds a different nuance to what Jedi on the Run could have turned into. I love that they gave us a different galaxy. I loved how Clone Wars added context to the prequels. I love how the animated series made Darth Maul one of the most impressive and deep characters in the story, right? Like, I loved how Solo brought him back, right? A lot of people were like, oh, that was a mistake. I felt out of it in there. Like, how did he come back? And it's like, there's a whole lot of story there that you can learn and find out why, and it can be a surprise to you. But every time one of the movies comes out, like I loved when Force Awakens came out, or Last Jedi came out, or even Rise of Skywalker came out, and it forced me to go back and watch the entire saga in a different light. And all of the events of the different movies in a different light. Like Last Jedi in particular, going back and watching Empire and Attack of the Clones, those middle chapters and how they work and what tests get put up against, you know, our hero. In the case of Attack of the Clones, it's Anakin, and in the case of Empire, it's Luke. In the case of Last Jedi, it's Rey, and how their mentors react. Or, Force Awakens, knowing that Harrison Ford, or Han Solo, was there to be the mentor character for Rey, and then going back and going, wait, that mentor character always dies by a red lightsaber sacrificing themselves.
Right.
Knowing that that's coming, because that's really how Star Wars stories are told, but how differently it happens and how different the understanding can be, and how watching Attack of the Clones and Empire Strikes Back, or not Attack of the Clones and Empire Strikes Back, watching A New Hope and Phantom Menace makes Han's death even more tragic, right? Where Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan make that sacrifice at the hands of a red lightsaber, and know that they can find a path of immortality through the Force, versus Han making that sacrifice knowing that door isn't open for him.
Right.
Because of how much he loves his son, which is in itself recontextualizes Vader's sacrifice for Luke in Return of the Jedi. So like all of those things hit so much harder once you see the new material. It's not a retcon. It's not like, oh, they added that after the fact, so it shouldn't count. It's we're deepening the layers of this storytelling and showing you new ways to see it.
Right. And also, I mean, here's my thing always, and especially I feel like the Acolyte has been a really interesting exercise in this particular thing, which we've talked about before, that I know some people's takeaway from especially this last episode is like, oh, well, the Jedi were bad. And it's like, no, the whole point is that trying to parse everything in such simplified terms as heroes and villains or good and bad ultimately robs characters of their agency, and also doesn't appreciate the fact that like they're all, for lack of a better term, because there are many species represented, they're all human and fallible. Like that's what gives us a connection to these stories and makes them so important to us, right? Because we learn about ourselves in the media that we watch. Like, that's what good media does. So it makes you think about how the themes and concepts and ideas relate to your own experience and your own sense of right and wrong, and how, people behave in the world. And
Well, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, and so, part of having this multi point of view storytelling is to show that, like, none of those things are exactly right. None of the versions that we've seen are probably exactly correct. And that is because every person in the mix, one, brings their own lens to it, and two, is a fallible person whose emotions and preconceived ideas are impacting the way that they are taking in new information.
There's three moments in the prequel trilogy that I want to point out specifically that the Acolyte really, really hits upon, that I think George Lucas was really wise to, that sort of shed light on this conversation. And a lot of people joked at the beginning of Revenge of the Sith when the opening crawl said, "War, there are heroes on both sides, evil is everywhere." But that's so true for the Separatists and for the Republic, and it's so true of the Jedi and the witches, right? Like, if you look at in Acolyte, right, you've got heroes on both sides. Between Mother Anastasia and Mother Coral are both very, very opposite.
Right.
You've got Saul and Indara sort of at opposite ends of that spectrum too. Like,
yep.
And none of it is it. Everybody keeps asking for gray Jedi, and we're finally getting Jedi with shades of gray, which I think is inherently more interesting, because they all have to determine what is good. And that's the third point, is that Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith, well, no, this is the second point. Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith tells Anakin straight up, good is a point of view. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing inherently incorrect about that statement. And it goes back to something Anakin is told by Padme, where he says, I think we should put everybody in a room in Attack of the Clones. Right. We should put everybody in a room and just make them do what's best for everybody. And she's like, well, that's exactly what we do, but people don't always agree, right? Like, all of those points of view in the Senate have contributed to its dysfunction. And that is something that hits so hard with this point of view discussion, especially in the Acolyte, because you've got Saul trying to, how he treats May, and how the Stranger's treating Osha, and how the Jedi are being very aggressive and the Sith are being very soft about it. It's very interesting. It's so fascinating, and that they're manipulating those points of view as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love that in general, the episode has not come out yet, but I guested on Talkin' Tauntauns yesterday. We recorded, and one of the things that I talked about is how every single entity in the Acolyte or act or concept has a counter. Like, there is duality to every idea and every scenario, just about. And how if you could build a Venn diagram that takes all of that into account, it would be beautiful and extraordinary. Because we get it in layers, just as you mentioned. Like, Anastasia and Coral are both parents to these girls, but very different. And then you have, Saul and Chimere essentially want the same thing, right? They each want a student very, very badly, and they want that kind of relationship. Then they, of course, go at it very differently. And then you have, even within the Jedi, just as you said, you have Saul and you have Indara, who, by the way, speaking of recontextualizing, after episode 7, I want way more Indara stuff, because she got super interesting in the course of that episode.
I want to point out too, really quickly, that if people have noticed the titles of those episodes, where a lot of the one-off episodes have the master/apprentice or whatever sort of title, but the first flashback episode was called Destiny, and the opposite of that is episode 7, and that was called Choice.
Yes.
And that those are different views and different looks at those sorts of things. I thought that was really clever and interesting, and I don't know. It is that, do we have free will and choice, or are we fated to do things? Are we destined to do things? And that's something the Skywalkers struggle with for a long time.
Yeah.
And so, like, everything that this series is exploring feels very inherently the sort of things that Star Wars ought to explore and has explored. And part of it is that point of view, right? Like, what do we know and how does that affect how we act? Going back to Last Jedi, that's exactly how we get into Snoke's throne room, where Rey and Ben and even Snoke have all seen a vision of what that future is. And they all see something different based on their own point of view, right? Like, Rey and Ben both see themselves joining forces. But Rey sees
different
Ben,
ways.
Yeah, Rey sees Ben joining her side and eschewing the First Order and joining the light and fighting back to back with her. And he sees her doing the opposite, eschewing the light and eschewing all of the old things that she's holding on to and joining him in his quest to be the supreme leader. And they're so convinced of the other that when they come to loggerheads trying to take that lightsaber and he offers her to join him and she offers him to join her, they're at a complete impasse. And it's so beautiful because they both saw the same vision and they didn't understand how the other had seen it because they were both so convinced that the only way they'd seen it was the way to see it.
Yes, this is another thing that I am really, really enjoying in the Acolyte, is that part of the problem, and I feel like this is such a reflection of issues that happen in our own world and even in the Star Wars microcosm, issues that happen within fandom, is that everyone thinks they know better, right? Like, no, I know what Star Wars is. I know this isn't the right way to do it. And it's like, no, the whole point is that everybody thinks that their perception is the correct one, and that is what leads to problems.
Ours is, though, for reals, though, Holly. No, I do think there is something to how we approach it versus other folks, where there is that openness and that ability to change minds, the ability to explore things from the perspective that I don't know, at least me, like, I mean, I'll be honest, I did not enjoy my first viewing of Rise of Skywalker.
I didn't either.
But sitting down and trying to figure out what the authorial intention was and how it fit into everything and how it recontextualized everything and what they were trying to do made me enjoy it a hell of a lot more.
Yeah.
Rather than just fighting it and watching YouTube videos to sort of fuel that anger.
Right. I mean, my approach was kind of different, where I'm like, there are things I like about it, and I'm just going to hang my hat on those. And I don't need to worry about the stuff that I don't connect to as much, right? Because that's fine. It's just not the part that's not for me, and that's okay.
You're wrong, Holly. We need to fight about this.
Okay, if you want.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. We don't need
never... But I mean, I do. It's been so interesting to me, the sort of meta nature of this show, where all of the conflict of this show comes from characters thinking that they understand a situation and they have more insight than anyone else in the mix and acting on it, and thus causing a boatload of problems. And I'm like, this is exactly what happens in people talking about this show.
Well, it's so startling how relevant that is for our current political landscape too.
Oh, like, yeah.
People feel like they have this monopoly on truth and understanding of what's really going on. And it's hard to I mean, I have that too, where it's like, I know what's going on politically, and I think that the conclusions I come to are correct. The thing that this show is trying to show us and dissect for us, and I think a lot of Star Wars has, whether that's The Last Jedi, whether that's Yoda talking about his wisdom in Empire Strikes Back, is that we have to understand that, like, other people have come to the same conclusion. Other people have come to different conclusions to the same amount of rigor as we do, and that doesn't make us any more wrong or right than they are. And And so we have this a very divided political landscape in the world, not just the United States, but around the world right now.
Oh yeah.
Because of that sort of separate, those separate tracks of information. I kind of joke that, like, I don't think it's actually a joke, but like at the gym, I'll see like 10 minutes of Fox News and go like, this does not reflect reality at all.
Right.
Like, and people who watch this and think that this is the truth, this is how we get the difference between Morlocks and Eloy. Like, eventually, down the line.
Right.
That's just, I don't know. I took us to a weird place. Anyway, from a certain point of view, this subject is one of the reasons I love The Last Jedi so much. That there's so much, like, every character has to grapple with what their point of view is, right? Like, even down to Finn's perception of how great Canto Bight is, to Rose's, like, actually look closer because this place is not awesome. Or to Poe, right? What Poe sees the situation as and how he reacts based on the information he has versus listening to the orders of those above him. He does it twice, once against the Fulminatrix, the Dreadnought, and once again to lead his mutiny. And both times, like, the first time it was like a toss-up, like, was he wrong? I don't know. Maybe that Dreadnought would have killed them. But the second time, he's quantifiably wrong. And his actions on the way to that mutiny caused the plan that Holdo did have to fail in ways that she couldn't have predicted. Like, how would she have predicted that Finn would find out, or that Poe would find out about her escape plan and then go on an open channel and tell someone who would sell that information to the First Order in the next half hour? Right? Like, she doesn't find out about his plan till after that happens. And Poe, because he tries to see things from an incomplete perspective and wants to act from incomplete information, foils a lot of stuff and costs a lot of people their lives.
Yeah.
Because that's his point of view. I don't know. I love that stuff. I love digging into that deepness in Star Wars like that. And there's not a Star Wars property that this doesn't touch either. There's not a movie it doesn't touch. There's not a TV show it doesn't touch in some way. Even Obi-Wan Kenobi is so much about Obi-Wan's point of view of himself.
Right.
Which is interesting, right? Like, because it actually helps bridge that gap between Obi-Wan in Revenge of the Sith saying, I failed you. And this Anakin saying, like, you didn't make me, I made myself. And Obi-Wan seeing that the Anakin he knew was truly dead.
Star Wars, you're so complex and beautiful.
No, it's, a lot of people will go like, it's just a kid's show. And it is to a degree. But the people making it have so much care for storytelling and so much attention to detail that there is so much of this stuff that is just hanging around with everything, right? Like, it's so good.
Yeah, I mean, I love it, obviously. I'm very excited for the finale of The Acolyte, and simultaneously, I don't want it to be the finale, like pretty much everyone else who's watching.
Yeah, no, I think the only people rooting it to fail are the ones who've only read reports about what the show's about instead of actually watching it.
Yeah, I want it to go on for a long time. I really do want an Indara spinoff now. It's a fascinating place, and it does make me often think, right? I really feel like Chimere / the Stranger, whatever we want to call him, that moment where he and Osha are discussing, different ways to access the power of the Force And she says, that's the way of the dark side. And he says, semantics. I'm like, to me, that is the line that unlocks the whole thing and the whole bigger discussion that we're having, right?
Yeah.
It's so beautifully summed up in that moment. And I know to some people that was kind of like a comedy line, and there is a funny read to it, but I just was like, oh my God, that it really is that's everything.
And see, that's another one of those recontextualizations where after you watch episode 5, when the stranger kind of reveals himself and kills everyone, and you go back and watch episode 2 and watch him just sort of mix up that poison without even a second thought, and you're like, or him mentioning the Sith code and bringing that into there. Like, these were clues I read and made guesses about, but now watching them again, it's so obvious that that's where they were going, because those things have been so capably recontextualized.
Yeah.
Or even stuff like, there's so much in those episodes, especially about May and Osha, about who's who. That's what I loved actually about the design of the first episode entirely, where it's like learning that May and Osha are twins and they both exist forces me to recontextualize everything of the opening sequence and everything of the second sequence. You know what I mean? Like, that's good storytelling, because you want the audience and the reader, like, you want the audience engaged.
Yeah.
To try to work on that puzzle and have those surprises come at them, or even if they figure them out a minute or two sooner than you reveal it, that their ability to do that will make them feel engaged, unless they're just passive viewers that don't want that and just sort of want to be spoon-fed. And I don't know why I'd want to be that kind of viewer. I don't know why, like, that doesn't make for entertaining viewing for me. Which is, I guess, maybe why I don't like sitcoms for the most part. You know what I mean?
Well, I was going to say, like, there's a place for that. I mean, listen, like, I will be the first to tell you that, like, at the end of a long work day or a rough week, there's nothing I like more than watching some garbage Bravo TV, right? But
you're watching it for a different reason.
Right. That's usually like to just let my brain unwind and get the schadenfreude of watching rich and very attractive people be miserable and yell at each other. But I feel like with Star Wars, if all you really like is lightsaber battles, there's so much of that you can watch.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but the lightsaber battles in the Acolyte are really good.
Woo! They're really good. I was even, and I'm surprised there hasn't been more chatter about it, but I've also been kind of busy and not online all that much, so maybe there has been and I missed it. Saul and Kel Naka, that fight is intense. Oof. And, like, it's both simultaneously scary and a joy to watch. Like, it's so good. So
that's another one of those recontextualization moments where you go back to episode 2 and see Master Torben with his face still messed up from Kel Naka.
Yeah. Listen, don't upset a Wookiee. It's what we know.
No.
Or don't engage with the Wookiee that's being mind controlled by witches. Don't do that either. Don't you want to know what that whole thing was after we have seen, like, the way Anastasia got in Torben's head and was having that whole, like, give and take with him of kind of taking over his consciousness? Like, don't you wonder what happened with the Kel Naka version of that?
Yup. I want to see so much of this. I don't want this show to end with one more episode.
Me either.
Yeah, so, I mean, as you're listening to this, we're, like, at T-minus, like, who knows how many hours from the last one.
Yeah.
But I love how well written it is, and I love how much nuance there is to it, and how many shades of gray it adds to things, and how deeply layered it is, and how those layers get peeled back episode after episode. I have no idea how they're going to stick the landing, but I'm positive they will. But I love that's one of those things that, like, Star Wars, the endings in Star Wars have always been so surprising but inevitable. Like,
yeah,
I remember when Clone Wars was going, and us all just going like, Ahsoka's got to die. Right? Like, how's Ahsoka going to die?
Right.
And then from our perspective, knowing in quotation marks, that Ahsoka had to die, how many times Filoni and company played with that notion that we thought she had to die, so they'd put her in life-threatening danger, and us go, oh my lord, is this the time where it happened?
Oh, yeah.
And then when she shows up in
and
Rebels,
over.
it's like, wait a second, how did she survive? And Dave's just kind of like, of course she did. Or when we saw her leave the Jedi Order, and it's like, okay, I can see maybe she got around some of this. But then actually watching how she gets through Order 66, it was surprising but inevitable. It felt that, like, of course she had to be with Rex. Of course that had to go down the way it did, but we were so shocked that that's the way it went down. Or the ending of Rebels, where, again, we just felt like we don't see Phoenix Squadron in the Battle of Yavin. Right? Like,
Right.
Why wouldn't Phoenix Squadron be in the Battle of Yavin? This is going to have to go south for them badly, especially when they've got Thrawn facing them. And to see how much that storytelling that opened, because we actually got a happy ending at the end of the story of a small band of rebels before Alderaan.
Right.
That they were able to liberate Lothal, and Lothal was like, the Empire got so spread thin because of the tidal wave of resistance that they helped make, that Cassian helped make, that Luthen Rael helped push forward, that General Dodonna's group did, that Leia, that Mon Mothma, that everybody worked for. It grew so large that the Empire just had to abandon Lothal after Thrawn was gotten rid of, because they just didn't have the resources to just keep putting those things down. And then we had that really happy but bittersweet ending on Rebels. It was a surprise, but it felt so right when it happened. And I'm feeling that the Acolyte is going to be very surprising in its ending, but inevitable. And I hope it doesn't prey too much on what our points of view are.
We'll see. It's very soon.
Yeah.
Oh.
But no, I think people forget when they watch Clone Wars now, Ahsoka's fate was not...
We all thought she was going to die when that show launched.
Yeah.
We're like, we've never seen her outside of this, so she must have gotten killed off. Right? I mean, that was the discussion for the longest time.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not how that went down.
No, not at all.
Thankfully.
Yeah. Man, no, there's so much to those points of view, that idea that got introduced in Star Wars in its very DNA, is that those truths that we cling to depend on our own point of view. And that's how every character is operating. That's how every character makes their decisions. That's how every artist, writer, filmmaker approaches Star Wars as well. And so you've got a lot of that. And that's one of the things that I think George Lucas was so great at, and that Kathleen Kennedy's been so wonderful at emulating, is just bringing out the highest and best creativity of a group of writers in the most collaborative, or not writers, but artists in the most collaborative art form, to take all of those different points of view and find the people to synthesize them into a singular vision.
Yeah.
And I think that makes Star Wars sort of a miracle.
Yeah. I mean, I keep thinking about, really, it has been so clearly telegraphed to us, the audience, that everyone has an alternate point of view, with Qui-Gon saying your focus determines your reality. That it does strike me as kind of funny when so much focus of people trying to parse these stories is like, okay, but what's the truth? And it's like, there is no truth.
Yeah.
There is no one truth. And I marvel that we have had so much, as you said, so much storytelling that upholds that same concept of like everybody's truth is going to be different. There's no way around it.
That's something that's actually really interesting and worth pointing out. There's a small band of folks that complain about the direction Star Wars is heading, that don't actually seem to have soaked in any of the lessons of Star Wars. And one of the first ones, one of the most important, is that moment from Qui-Gon you just said, that your focus determines your reality. And if you're focused on trying to find plot holes rather than trying to understand why things are the way they are, your reality is going to be a plot hole rather than a rational explanation for what's going to happen.
Right.
It reminds me, this is going to be a really deep pull, and maybe nobody's going to remember it, or maybe it's going to seem weird, but
listen, you already went to H.G. Wells, so
have you read the Chronicles of Narnia?
Not all of them.
Okay, in the last battle, which is sort of the last book by any reckoning, basically Aslan creates this like version of Narnia that's sort of like heaven. But the dwarfs don't believe that it exists. So the dwarfs are like sort of tied up against each other, and they're like, we're in this black hole, like none of this is real. And Aslan's like, or like the kids are like, look around you, like open your eyes, like you can see, like that's not what the situation is. And Aslan tells them like, no, they can't see it because they don't believe it. Right. And so I look at some of these folks who are like trying to point out these plot holes or flaws that aren't actually there, as the dwarves sort of tied up against each other going like, no, that's not real, I'm not going to do it. Right. And it's like everybody, all of us are going like, but just open your eyes. And they're like, no. And then because they don't believe it, they're never going to. They don't, I don't know. That seems like a really weird cut, but that moment's always stuck with me from those books from childhood.
I don't think it's a really weird cut. I understand completely where you would draw parallels. I mean, I haven't read it, but based on your description, that makes complete sense that would, one would remind you of the other.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny, too, because C.S. Lewis was just going through a really, really, really forceful, like, Christianity analogy where it's like, these are atheists, but I like this reading better because I'm an atheist.
Right.
But from their point of view, none of it existed. None of it. None of it. But I want more. I love this more complicated Star Wars, but I think this is what made Star Wars resonate with me from such a young age, is that every time I watch it, no matter how old I get, no matter how many times I watch it, it gives me something new. It gives me something new to think about. It gives me something new to think about the other parts of it. Every time I watch one of the shows, it gives me something to meditate on as far as the movies go, as far as I watch any of the cartoons. It gives me things to meditate on elsewhere. The entire mythos is something that's just like deep and engaging. And because it's ever being added to and it's ever evolving, there's nothing for me to just go like, I'm done. I won Star Wars. Like you don't just hit the finish line.
No, everything can shift your perception of everything else.
And I can understand if there's people where like something new shifts your perception in a way where you're just like, I can't do this anymore. Yeah. Or I don't want to do it anymore. That's fine. But for me, that hasn't happened yet. I haven't hit that point. I think the thing that might make me hit that point is when there's going to be like an R-rated Star Wars movie or something where it's like, I can't take my kids to that. Andor sort of edges that a little bit. Really? I love Andor, but I feel like watching it with kids is a little risky sometimes. I mean, it opens in a brothel.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I don't. Well, yeah. I don't know that to me that feels. Again, I'm not a parent. Let me preface what I'm about to say with this. I'm not a parent, but to me, that level in Andor obviously a much more serious show overall than a lot of other Star Wars. But like, I'm like, but then like, is that so different from Jabba putting women in really scantily clad outfits and making them dance while they're chained to him? Like,
yeah, no, that's fair. And I'm going to say, like, Andor's not something I'm not going to show my kid. Like, if Kingston's like, I want to watch Andor, we're going to watch it. I think I'm capable of having that discussion, but I know that Star Wars has been, and from the very beginning, a story for 12-year-olds, as George Lucas likes to say, and there are 12-year-olds who aren't going to be able to access all of it,
Right.
because their parents are going to say, no, hard pass, that's a little too much.
Right.
Or that I'm going to have to explain to my kid, like, no, it's an R-rated Star Wars movie, I can't take you to it. You know what I mean?
Right.
At least until I see it. I mean, that was something like with Revenge of the Sith, that was an issue, right? Where it's like, is this going to be too much for the kids? I got to see it first. It was fine, I think. I think it was Guillermo del Toro when he was doing an interview once, like, I want to say he was frustrated by the rating of Pan's Labyrinth being rated R.
Mm.
And he was saying that, like, it really is a children's fairy tale. And it's because he thinks fairy tales and children's stories should contain frightening things, because that's
Right.
how children learn bravery. And I think Revenge of the Sith is in that same vein, where it's like, yes, children should experience some of those terrifying things in their stories so they know how to confront them in their real lives.
There's a great, was it an old NPR interview with Shel Silverstein, who said very similar stuff, where
That would not surprise me at all.
he said, and I will say what he said, which will get an R2 bleep, but he mentioned at one point where they were asking why children connect to his stories, and he said, because I never bullshit them. And he's like, the world is scary. You're going to encounter scary things. And if you can trust that a grown-up is going to show you those potential scary things, or something like a scary thing, and show you a way through, you're going to trust them more than a grown-up that protects you all the time from, like, ever knowing about them. And I was like, oh, that's a very interesting perspective. Again, I'm not a parent, so I don't,
No, I think that's absolutely, spot on.
right. Like and I mean, for my part as a human, that definitely helps me more with my anxiety if I'm in a situation, not even dealing with a parent or an adult to a child relationship, but like, even if there's like a work thing and I'm like, these 7 things could go wrong, and they'd be like, yes, but we have contingencies for all of them. We recognize that those things are going to go wrong. And it's like, great, I feel safe, versus, oh, that's not going to happen. That won't happen to us. Like, then you're like, ugh. I mean, it's the same thing, just in the version where a kid has to trust an adult, because kids have anxieties. They can see that there are possible dangers. Like, that's why childhood is scary for a lot of people. So yeah, I do love that way of looking at it, that, scary things can be for kids, especially if you have an adult that can guide you through it.
Yeah. No, I think that's really smart, at least from my perspective.
And yes, again, my perspective being, I do not have children.
Yeah. So we're at about time, Holly. Where can people find you?
I am on Twitter as Surliest Girl, and on Instagram as SurlyGirly5. You can also find me at San Diego Comic-Con if you're going on Friday at 10 a.m. in room 7AB. I will be on a panel about Galaxy's Edge and all the things that we love about Batuu and some of the deeper lore of Batuu. I also have a book coming out in October with cocktails from Criminalia. So you can also listen to Criminalia, the podcast, as well as Stuff You Missed in History Class. I think that's it for the moment. How about you, Brian?
You can find me online at swankmotron.com or across social media at swankmotron. I just wrapped up sort of a big game store book tour for my newest Battletech book, which is called Without Question, which if you're interested in signed copies of that, you can go to my website for that. And I've got some more cool stuff coming out, and a whole bunch of Topps Star Wars cards coming out in the latter half of this year that I can't wait to talk about. As far as Full of Sith goes, you can go to fullofsith.com and listen to the entire back catalog of episodes going back to 2013 and listen to every single one of them. You can also email us at holocron@fullofsith.com, or if, you want to rate and review the show wherever it is you listen to it, we'd certainly appreciate that. But in the meantime, unless you think there's anything else, Holly.
I think that's a thorough and comprehensive guide to where to find our things.
Then for super producer Mike Pilot and for Holly Fry, I'm Brian Young, and the Force will be with you always.
Sir, if you'll not be needing me, I'll close down for a while.